Hi, ladies and gentlemen. This is Tamala Stobbs with the April edition of Connect Homeowners Monthly Market Report. Let's get started. Boy, what a month it's been. Instead of giving you a report like we normally do, we've decided to make it the top 5 questions you want the answer to right now in the market. We feel it's important that we are answering the questions that are causing the most concern, the confusion, and the fear in the market. Here's the bad news. You're not going to get any of that out of last month's monthly market report because you could take last month's monthly market report and throw it out. At the beginning of March, we were talking about having a sensational year. It wound up that January and February, we sold more houses in this country than any other January and February in more than a decade. So we were in for a real prime phenomenal year. And then, bam, everything gets put on hold. So let's answer questions that everyone is asking. The 5 questions that we are hearing most are: when is the economy going to recover? Are we going into a recession? Is this going to be like 2008 all over again? What about all those job losses? And what should you do right now? When is the economy going to recover? Let's start with when it's going to recover. Ladies and gentlemen, understand that what just happened to the American economy is someone hit the pause button. This is not like 2008. 2008 was like a tornado. It came rushing through, destroyed all the buildings, leveled everything right to the ground. When that tornado passed through, we had to rebuild all those buildings. It took years to rebuild that town, just like it took years after 2008 to rebuild the housing market and to rebuild the mortgage market even more so. What we're going through right now is like a hurricane. The eye of the storm is over us, and the storm isn't over yet. But eventually it will blow over. And after that, the sun will come out. All the buildings are still intact. And I'm not saying we're going to go right back to the way it was immediately. But it's not going to take us long. We don't have to rebuild anything. We just have to get back to work. So there's a big difference between those two. Another analogy I like to use for the older people that are watching, remember the VCR? We used to have this little cassette and we'd plug it in. We couldn't stream movies. We actually had to buy a cassette with the movie on it. Well, if we use that analogy going back to 2008, someone took our VCR and smashed it with a sledgehammer. And it took us a long time to put it back together again. The electrical wiring and everything. This time around, we're watching a movie. Somebody hit the pause button. As soon as they let us hit the play button, there's no restructuring. We just have to go back to work. So I want to let you know when that time will probably happen. I have done some research. We have the forecast from Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and Morgan Stanley. They're all saying the same thing. We're in for a wild ride over the next 90 days. But we're also in for a wild ride up through the rest of the year. And if you look at the graph, you can see that every one of the financial institutions that we have on the graph agree that's exactly what's going to happen. We're going to have what they call a V type of recovery. Strong down, strong up. Like if we took a tennis ball and threw it as hard as we could against the ground, it would bounce right back up again. And everyone is agreeing to that. And that's the good news. As a matter of fact, John Burns Consulting has actually done analysis on this. This is a quote from their research team. Historical analysis showed us that pandemics are usually V-shaped, sharp recessions that recover quickly enough to provide little damage to home prices, and some very cutting-edge search engine analysis by our information management team showed the current slowdown is playing out similarly thus far. So, John Burns Consulting, a major consulting firm in the real estate industry, has studied past pandemics, and they're saying it's going to be a V-shape, and it's not going to impact housing prices dramatically. All right, behind that, we just saw that Harvard Business Review just put out a paper saying it's worth looking back at history to place the potential impact path of COVID-19 empirically. In fact, V-shapes monopolize the empirical landscape of prior shocks, including epidemics such as SARS, the 1968 H3N2 Hong Kong flu, and the 1958 H2N2 Asian flu, and 1918 Spanish flu. So in each of those cases, whether it was major pandemics, there was a V-shaped return in the economy. So I want everyone to feel comfortable that, yeah, we're in for a wild ride down. We have to buckle in for the next 90 days. But after that, we have to be prepared for a wild ride up. So if you're thinking about selling your house or thinking about buying a house, it's just been delayed. It has been put on pause, and it will be full steam ahead when this ends. So during this time, we are working to put systems in place to be prepared, not only to handle the business that would normally come in, like say in July, August, and September, but to also handle the backup of business that will be coming from part of March, April, May, and June. So know you will be in good hands with Connect Homeowners when we get to the other side of this. And we are keeping ourselves active right now and staying in touch with each of you so that when the time comes, when they hit that play button, again, we're ready to go. Are we going into a recession? Now, because of this major drop in the GDP expected in this quarter, there's going to be a lot of recession talk. Understand that that should not scare you. Recession does not equal housing crisis. And as a matter of fact, Doug Bryan, the CEO from Mind Property Management, said this recently. With the exception of two recessions, the Great Recession from 2007 to 2009, and the Gulf War recession from 1990 to 1991, no other recessions have impacted the U.S. housing market, according to Freddie Mac Home Price Index data collected from 1975 to 2018. So they did research, and you know what they found? Recessions normally don't impact the housing market. In 2008, because the housing market and the mortgage market meltdown had a major impact on the economy, prices fell 19.7%. But just like the research done on the Freddie Mac Home Price Index, this is on the CoreLogic National Home Price Index. And they found the same exact thing, that 3 of the last 4 recessions, it didn't have a dramatically negative impact. So I think that what we're looking at right now is that we're in really good shape. Is this going to be like 2008? Well, the next question that we all want the answer to, is this going to be like 2008? Are we going to see the bottom fall out? Are prices going to drop and the value of our homes go down? The short answer is no. I want to share with you a quote from Mark Fleming, the chief economist at First American. Says, "Many still bear scars from the Great Recession and may expect the housing market to follow a similar trajectory in response to the coronavirus outbreak. But there are distinct differences that indicate the housing market may follow a much different path. And while housing led the recession in 2008 and 2009, this time it may be poised to bring us out of it." So, what do we know there? We know that in 2008 and 2009, our real estate was at the epicenter of the downturn of the economic slowdown. And what we know today, entering into this year, the strength of the housing market is well positioned to bring us out of it. So our research team went back, took a look at the housing crash of 2008 and the stock market correction, and we found some interesting things. When we look back to 2008, we can see that the S&P went through a correction of about 51%. And through that time in 2007 and 08 and 09, home prices depreciated as well. Really, over the 3-year period, a cumulative depreciation of about just under 20%. And that's what we remember. Yet, when we start to take a look at what's happening today, we start to see a little bit different picture. And I want to share this quote from economist Dave Rosenberg. It says, "What 9/11 has in common with what is happening today is that this shock also generated fear, angst, and anxiety among the general public. People avoided crowds then as they believed another terrorist attack was coming, and are acting the same today to avoid getting sick. The same parts of the economy are under pressure: airlines, leisure, hospitality, restaurants, entertainment, consumer discretionary services in general. Very similar to what we're seeing today, where our economy had put on pause as people are self-sheltering in place during this time." So when we take the same approach to the dot-com and the 9/11 crash, we see a different picture. We see an S&P correction during that time of about 45%. But during the same time in 2000, 2001, and 2003, we actually see home price appreciation during that time. So a very different picture from 2008 than what we saw in 9/11. So this really forces us to look at what is different today and how does today's market compare to 2008. And I want to take a couple of comparisons here and start off with home price appreciation. When we look back to 2008, the 6 years leading up to the housing crash, we know we had high appreciation. And we look at the 6 years leading up to today, we see we're nowhere near where we were during that time. Really, the highest year in the last 6 years is not even equal to the lowest year leading up to the housing crash. And while prices are rising, what we don't have is runaway appreciation. Important to remember in this visual. The next thing we want to look at is mortgage credit availability. Basically, how easy is it to get a loan? And we use the Mortgage Credit Availability Index from the Mortgage Bankers Association each month to measure that. And what we know, the taller the graph, the easier it is to get a loan. So what we see is on the left side of this graph, the Mortgage Credit Availability Index at the time of the housing bubble when it was high. And we see where it is today. Nowhere near it was pre-crash, because we know at that time this pendulum swung back. And credit requirements and what it took to get a loan that made it much harder for people to qualify. So something important that we want to look at as we compare these two markets. Now let's talk about inventory. Entering this year, the biggest challenge we were prepared for in the housing industry was inventory. Literally not enough homes on the market for the number of people that wanted to buy. So if we take a balanced market of 6 months and we look back to 2007, we know there were just over 8 months of supply of inventory on the market, leading us to above 6 months being a buyer's market and below six months being a seller's market. So today we're at 3.1 months of inventory on the market. We literally don't have an oversupply of homes on the market for people that want to buy them. The next thing we want to take a look at is home equity and how consumers are using their equity then and now. This gives a really good picture of 2008 and the 3 years leading up to 2008. You see on the left side here, $824 billion was cashed out as cash out refis during that time. And we know the 3 years leading up to today, that number is $232 billion. A fraction of what it was back then. Back then, people were using their homes almost as an ATM, taking equity out of their homes, putting it into depreciating assets, buying vacations, going on trips, doing things, financing lifestyle, thinking this is never going to end. And this shows you how consumers are treating equity today. And it's very different than 2008. And what we also know is that 53.8% of all the homes in this country have at least 50% equity. We know that because 37% of the homes are owned free and clear. And then when you take the remaining homes, 26.7% of those have at least 50% equity, which gives us this number of 53.8% of homes have equity. A very different position than 2008. In 2008, when we had homes leveraged to the hilt, that home loses a little bit of value, and you literally owe more on the home than what it's worth. People walk away. People aren't walking away today with the equity they have in homes. $50,000 or $100,000 of equity in their home, they're going to stay there. And they're treating their homes very, very differently than what we saw in 2008. The next thing I wanted to look at is the percent of median income needed to purchase a median priced home. And what we know pre-bubble is that number was a lot higher than what it is today. Back in 2006, just over 25% of someone's income was dedicated to their home and their housing need. Today, that number is just under 15% of income dedicated to the housing need. And we know again a very different picture as we look at all these things to compare 2008 to today. I hope that gives everybody a better understanding of the real estate market today versus 2008. The next thing we want to talk about is unemployment and about all the job loss that's out there. There's a lot of confusion out there. There are a lot of people, doomsday sayers, Chicken Little, saying the sky is falling. I do want to be frank that we do have one challenge, and that's the job loss. 10 million people lost their jobs in the last 2 weeks. So we can take a look at a graph and see, compared to any other time in American economic history, going all the way back to 1970, we can see that this is just a different time. Now, let's take a look at those numbers in a little deeper context. The numbers you're seeing with the red graph going all the way up is from the U.S. Labor Department. That's the number of unemployment claims. So that's the number of people that have filed unemployment claims for the week of March 22nd to March 28th. And I'm going to show you another graph in a second that's from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that takes the information from people collecting the unemployment insurance and gives us some analysis of that information. So the graph I'm about to show you actually didn't take place because of the timing. It did not count many of those 10 million because the study on the people collecting unemployment was done on the week of March 14. At that point in time, 701,000 people had already lost their job, nowhere near the over 10 million we are out now. But I do want to break down the 701,000. Who were those people? Because that will give us some sign as to how quickly they'll come back to work. We don't know if this is going to be reflective of the new analysis that the Bureau of Labor Statistics was going to bring on May 8th. But we'll get that to you and let you see what the differences are. But right now, this is what the first 700,000, so let's take a look at who they are. Number one, 59.5% are food service and drinking places, meaning they're servers and bartenders. When the restaurants open back up, all of them go back to work immediately. Starting at the bottom, construction workers. The new construction was finally starting to take off. And all of a sudden, they got hit with, supply chain issues and everything else. Those people will be back at work. Healthcare office workers. You're probably wondering, how could healthcare workers have a challenge? These are all the people that are working in the doctor's office, in the dentist's office. They're all going to go back to work. We're going to need dentistry. We're going to need to go to the doctor. Child care workers? Well, we have to spend 2 months or 3 months with our kids. We're definitely going to want to get back to child care workers back to work. Heck, we will probably be willing to pay them double if we have to. Temporary help services. Obviously, since a business is not working, all the people that work in the temporary services to help that business staff itself, they're gone. Retail trade. All the stores are closed. Once they open back up, those people come back in. And the accommodation industry, the hotel industry, and obviously they might not rush right back in, but they'll eventually be back to work. All the other jobs not in those categories make up 9.8% of the 701,000 that were originally laid off. So we can see that the vast majority, over 90%, they kind of look like they're going to get their jobs right back. But this research was done in the middle of March. So it doesn't include the second half of March. And many of the 10 million were in the second half. The vast majority of people laid off are going to come back to work and will go back to the V type of recovery. They all lost their jobs on the way down, and most of them are going to get their jobs on the way up, but it's going to be ugly. The headlines are going to be ugly about the unemployment rate on May 8th. When the unemployment report comes out in May, it will be ugly. The Labor Department numbers on how many people are losing, collecting unemployment, that number is still going to be ugly. So just be prepared for those headlines. But I want to also prepare you that we will be coming back. This next slide is looking at Goldman Sachs unemployment rate projections. They're projecting that for this year, the height of the number is going to be 15%. There are a lot of projections, ladies and gentlemen. JP Morgan thinks it's going to be 8.5%. The Congressional Budget Office thinks it's going to be 12%. But I want to take one of the more dire projections so we can prepare for the worst and hope for the best. So what they're saying going forward, the unemployment rate is going to hit 15% this year. It'll be somewhere between 6 and 8% next year, down to 5%, down to 4% over the next couple of years. So it's nowhere near what we originally thought it would be, and nowhere near what some people are saying, like, oh, this is going to be the Great Recession all over again. We'll cover that in a slide in a second. But first, I want to just almost kill a myth that maybe even I had that I wasn't sure about, that I think almost everyone believes, and that's that the unemployment rate has a major impact on the number of sales done on an annual basis. So we put a graph together. I want you to take a look at this graph going all the way back to 1989. And what we see is there is no direct relationship between the unemployment rate and the number of houses sold. And we give you 3 instances of that. First, in the early 1990s, the unemployment rate went up to 7.5%. Home sales continued to increase. In the early 2000s, the unemployment rate went up to 6%. And guess what? Home sales continued to increase somewhat dramatically. And then the third one, when the housing crash occurred, the unemployment rate shot up to 9.6%, and yes, home sales fell. And I'm sure that has a major piece to do with it, but also understand that that was also the time when the banks, as we showed you earlier in the mortgage availability index, just shut off lending. So in 2008, we had a lot of customers that we knew were mortgageable, but they couldn't get a mortgage. The banks were so tight in their new standards. That is happening now to some extent, but we will see those tighter regulations loosen up as we come back online. Now, the fourth piece we want to take a look at for the last many years, the unemployment rate has been dropping like a rock. But look at home sales. They remain flat. So really, there's not a direct correlation. Now, I understand that 15% is different than 9.6%. I understand that it could have an effect, And we'll look at that effect as we look at how many people, in fact, do lose their jobs. And we'll look at those people and how quickly could get those jobs back. But this comparison to doomsday projections, oh, this is going to be a Great Depression again, all over again. We did the research, and this is what they're showing us. In the Great Depression, look at the unemployment rates for 6 years. 4 of those 6 years, it was over 20%. Now remember, in the graph we showed you before, when the unemployment rate went up to 7.5, that number did not impact home sales. Home sales continued to rise. So if we use 8% as the barometer, anything over 8%, there could be a challenge. Then we can see in the Great Recession, we had 3 years in a row of over 8% unemployment, and that definitely was a challenge. But if we look at the projections from Goldman Sachs, and again, they have probably the most conservative projections, they think it's going to be a little bit more difficult than most people think. But even if we use those dire projections, what we're looking at is, yeah, we're going to have a tough time this year, all right. But that doesn't mean it's all over for home sales going forward. I think we could still come back and rebound with a good year this year and going forward. They don't project any year once we're through this V shape to be over 8%. So I think that we're in a relatively good place. So now the question is, what should I do right now? The first thing I want you to remember is home ownership is an important source of wealth creation, enabling current homeowners and succeeding generations to move up the economic ladder. That's the great thing. Almost every family's, the vast majority of every family's net worth is in their home. And when those homes get passed down generation to generation, that helps future generations build more net worth, more family worth. So what we do for a living is not list and sell houses. We make dreams come true. We don't just mortgage homes. We mortgage a dream for you. And that's crucially important as we move forward in this, that we don't lose track of that we don't get caught up in all the things we can't do. I know there's a health crisis happening right now. Let's try not to take too much time worrying about that. We should be aware of it. We should keep our families safe. We should pray and care for the people that were and the families that were impacted by it. Ben Bernanke said in a report done in 2018, looking back at the mistakes that were made in 2008. My results do suggest that in the absence of the panic, the declines in employment, consumption and output in the early stages of the Great Recession would have been significantly less severe. If somehow we would have taken the panic out of that moment, job losses, goods purchased would have been significantly less severe. So amidst this confusion and concern, do not let it turn into panic and fear. Focus on what you can control and do what you can to keep you and your family safe out there. As always, we have included all the resources for you in the next 2 slides. Thank you all for watching. This is Tamala Stobbs with Connect Homeowners saying, stay safe and stay healthy. And remember to like and subscribe below.